Ben Butcher has joined us, the data editor, and we need data more than ever during this election. Ben, welcome to the Daily Tea again. I think your second appearance
is my second
on our
appearance,
very fine podcast. A lot of this podcast is about Nigel Farage's announcement that he will be standing in Clacton and that he's leading now the Reform Party. And I suppose for Camilla and me, Ben, first question, what effect are you seeing in the data from the decision by Nigel Farage?
So it's important to look at what's happening to Reform just before he took over the leadership of the party. They'd had a little bit of a lull in the polls, having had a big surge happening throughout kind of April and May. We won't see exactly what happens to his announcement and what happens in the polls for a few more days because it takes time to collect that data. But we do know that in mid-May, one poll showed that they received roughly a 6-point bounce if Farage took over the party. So for the Tories, this is a bit of a nightmare because they would be the main ones to see their polls decline as that kind of interaction happened. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens and whether that actually reflects in reality. There's the other things to look at as well. Firstly, Farage compared to Tice, he's a much more household name. We're talking 86% of people know the name Farage, 22% knew Tice. And when it comes to him as a popular figure within the Tory party, he had around a 50% favourability rating to Sunak's 41%. So
right.
He is going to be jumping
Tory
in.
voters, Ben?
That is Tory 2019 voters.
Farage to Sunak.
Wow.
Preferred Farage to Sunak.
And Richard Tice, just to remind everyone, was the leader of the Reform Party. What's his title now, Camilla?
Well, he's going to become chairman, and of course, he's the Reform candidate for Boston and Skegness.
That's right. Yes.
And
Sorry,
so,
Ben. Continue.
There was a YouGov poll from mid-April. So again, it will be interesting to see whether people start changing their views on him now that he's taking over leader of the party. And I also want to point out that when it comes to two demographics, which I think are vital for this election, which is the over 65s, I say vital for the Tories. He's more popular with them, and he's more popular again with that Brexit Leave voting group as well. Both areas which I know the Tories are targeting.
The grey wall and the red wall favours Farage.
Exactly.
And when you talk about sort of the polling and where it might go, I interviewed Farage on GB News last night, and he bragged to me that he felt that he could overtake the Tories, that Reform could overtake the Tories by next week. Is that probable? I
think if we're going back to that poll where we had him as leader, which is really all we can base on because things change very quickly once events actually happen, they'd be about 5 points behind the Tories. It could change very quickly. In terms of actually what that might mean for him, I mean, when you look at Farage, I think the one thing we do know is that he's probably going to win the seat, which would be a bit of a turn of events for Reform because they were projected in every single MRP poll we've had so far to get nothing. Whether or not gaining seats, or gaining vote share in the polls and actually overtaking the Tories means that will translate to seats, I think seems unlikely. And I think most people have said that so far.
But he wants to gain vote share and not get seats so that he can position himself as the person who does reform the political system, right? If we have a situation like 1983, SDLP get a 25% vote share or whatever it was and only get a few seats in return, if he can repeat that, then he turns it into a Brexit campaign Mark II. You're not represented by the political establishment. I'm the only one that can break up this system. And the next thing we know, he's out campaigning with Ed Davey for proportional representation.
Camilla, we've spoken about this. I think as well, Ian Duncan Smith very interestingly said that one of the major reasons for Nigel Farage doing this is publicity for what he believes to be the right route for Britain politically. That's a really important part of what he's doing. Ben, let's say he wins, let's say Reform win a handful of seats, maybe Richard Tice's seats, as you say, Nigel Farage's seat, maybe a couple of others. What are the Conservative seats that are at risk because some Conservative voters will go to Reform? So as you say, this is a headache for Sunak. How big a headache?
So we had this big MRP poll yesterday, which you might have talked about, which puts the Labour getting 422 seats in the next election. YouGov, who released a poll, actually said that based on what Reform was showing at that point, and this is before Nigel Farage did his announcement, they were looking roughly conservatively at about 16 seats of the Tories being lost because of Reform's presence. Professor John Curtis went on yesterday and said that's looking more like 60 seats with that involvement going on. And there these are happening. It's that red wall area, it's the northeast of England, it's the southeast of England, the kind of places where, yes, Brexit did incredibly well, and places where UKIP have traditionally performed well in the past, and Reform are kind of hoping, I assume, to repeat that UKIP paradox of doing very well, but not necessarily translating that to seats.
And on that note, is it true to say that a vote for Reform is a vote for Labour? Can we break that down, Ben?
I think that we've got to be very careful with making the assumption that every single Reform voter is a Conservative. There was polling done a couple of months ago which showed that if Reform weren't standing, around 31% of the voters would go to the Conservatives, around 30% would go to other parties, including about 5-6% to Labour, and the rest of them just wouldn't turn up at all to the votes. So I do think it's a little bit overgenerous to say that they're taking seats directly and only from the Conservatives. Again, it's exactly like UKIP, right? And I think that Nigel Farage made that point yesterday, that UKIP ended up having as big of an impact, if not greater, on Labour voters in those red wall areas that kind of flowed into other areas. So yes, I think there's an element of truth in it. If Sir Professor John Curtis is correct in saying that 60 seats go from the Tories because of the Reform presence, there is an element of truth. But 60 seats is nowhere near enough, based on what the current polls are saying, for the Tories to actually get a majority or get close to a majority.
So we're watching excitedly on the night of the election results rolling in. Which of the Tory big beasts are most at risk? You've done some analysis for the Telegraph, which was published this morning. Well,
one of them was just in the studio just now, Ian Duncan-Smith, who he's going into that election, as you said, with an incredibly small majority. I think it's a 1.5% swing needed towards Labour for them to take it. So it seems very likely at this point that he's going to be losing a seat. In terms of cabinet members, we have around 12 that are going to be losing their seats at this point, based on the latest big constituency level polling that we've seen. Most of them we already kind of knew were going to lose them, but we've added to that list Esther McVey up in Tatton in Cheshire.
Common sense minister,
and she is looking like she's going to be 1 point behind Labour based on the current polling. So that's going to be a very exciting one.
And this is before Farage's announcement. Let's just make that clear.
Yeah,
so this is bad news before possibly more bad news. Yes. So carry on, Ben, with the list.
The Transport
we love a list on this podcast, by the way.
We've got the Transport Secretary, Mark Harper, new to the list as well. And then just to fly through a few more, we've got Jeremy Hunt, Alex Chalk, who is the Justice Secretary.
And Rishi Sunak's bestie.
Simon Hart, Grant Shapps, Penny Mordaunt, Mel Stride, Johnny Mercer, Simon Hart, Victoria Prentice, David T.C. Davis and Gillian Keegan.
Penny Mordaunt's on a knife edge in Portsmouth, and yet obviously there's a lot of store behind her potentially leading the party in the future.
And we'll look forward to, she's doing one of the television debates up against Angela Rayner, the deputy leader of the Labour Party. And I wonder whether Penny Mordaunt has decided to do that to get her profile up, because she has got that tough fight, as you say.
But she has got more recognisability now after the coronation and her kind of...
huge sword wielding.
Indeed.
And then there's just a couple more names. Steve Baker, who...
Oh, Brexit hard man. Steve Baker. Wickham.
And Jacob Rees-Mogg, which...
I know you will be very upset about this, Kamal.
No, Camilla, not at all. No, Camilla, not at all. I think that there are dangers with a massive, huge majority for Labour. There are as many dangers in that, and also, as you were saying, if it is Penny Mordaunt, maybe some others, is Kemi Badenoch on that list?
She isn't, and I was going to say, the big beast who remaining is probably one of the more interesting ones, because these are the people who are going to be...
What's left?
But these are the people, as you say, Camilla, these are whoever's left in the Conservative Party, if the results are borne out by the polls, who is going to lead the Conservative Party? Because I'm interested, Camilla, from you. What do you think Sunak's... I asked Ian Duncan-Smith this question. What do you think Sunak's response should be to Nigel Farage standing? What should he do?
I think he should do sensible as opposed to extremist. So he should say, I can be trusted. I was Chancellor throughout a global pandemic. I can do the maths. I'm a respectable person. I believe in broad churchism. This guy's untried, untested. And a bit like Boris Johnson, he's a great campaigner, but he hasn't ever run anything. That's how I would approach it. Let's look at which big beasts might be left. David Davis, Priti Patel, Suella Braverman, Liz Truss. all on the right.
Kemi Badenoch.
Kemi Badenoch,
James Cleverly as well.
Yeah. James more centrist.
Braintree,
More
yeah.
centrist, but it's it's.
But then you've got to, who's also left in the more moderate space. One MP I can think of is Victoria Atkins, the Health Secretary, who's got a massive majority, and she's very One Nation.
Isn't she a risk, Ben? Victoria Atkins, I think, is on a list I've seen.
She was not enough on my list to be put down as
She's
a big
over
beast.
20,000.
Right, okay.
20,000 doesn't mean too much in isolation anymore, I'm
Maybe
afraid.
I'm
Do
being
you think,
not now.
I know we've got to wrap up, Ben, you've been so interesting as always. Do you think there is a possibility of a Canadian style, not total wipeout, but below 100 seats? Is that really a chance that that could happen?
I haven't seen any respectable polls or decent polling which pushes it that far down. But, I mean, if you're talking about the Conservatives falling to what's been estimated in the latest one, which was down to 140 for the Tories, that is a 100-year low for the party. It is as close you can get to a wipeout in the two-party system as possible, right?
Tory apocalypse.
You've got to practice saying that, Camilla.
Apocalypse or apocalypse?
Yeah.
It's easy for me to say.
So but I think what you say about the effective opposition thing is very true, because even back in 1997, Labour were projected at the moment to get roughly the same amount of seats, but the Tories have more seats as well. It's going to be that thing where you have 140 Tories in Parliament, the lowest they've had in 100 years. Who's the opposition at that point? Who can supply effective opposition? So I think that's going to be an interesting thing that, if the polls turn out well, that's going to be...
We should turn to this, Camilla, because if you have broken Conservatives, small Lib Dems, small SNP, small, maybe non-existent Reform, this is a big issue about the supermajority for Labour will be something we should discuss.
Definitely. Ben Butcher will
Ben,
let you
so
get back
brilliant
to
to
the
have
data
you.
chopping
Thank
block.
you very much.
Do you see what I've done there?
You're so good at this stuff, Camilla.